Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to our second plenary session, Big Shock, Big Reforms. So the name of this session really speaks for itself, as it's difficult to imagine a bigger shock in recent history than the COVID-19 pandemic on all aspects of people's lives, including, of course, education. But how can such shocks be a powerful catalyst for change and reform? Well, that's exactly what we'll be looking at in the next hour in this panel. We're going to hear from Mark Brackett, who's the founder and director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Mark will be telling us about the power of emotions to create a more equitable society. We also have an interesting conversation lined up for you with the Chinese journalist Zhou Yijun, who will talk to us about her odyssey into education systems around the world. And finally, we'll discuss the opportunities for reforms in this moment of worldwide shock to education systems. Well, this session, just a reminder, is live streamed on the WISE platform, LinkedIn, Facebook, as well as YouTube. And it's also live tweeted under the hashtags WISE Summit and EduReform. They're on your screens. Just remember to use this hashtag if you want to participate in the conversation on Twitter, and we encourage you to do so. And also, in terms of the languages and the translation, the session is translated, and the languages offered are Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, and French. So as I was saying, Mark Brackett is with us. He's the author of Permission to Feel. And in just a moment, he'll explain to us the power of emotional intelligence to achieve well-being and success, not only in school, but in life as well. But before we hear from Mark, let's just take a look at these statistics for a moment. So this is according to UNICEF. Recent UNICEF findings show that a median of 1 in 5 young people, that's 1 in 5, who are aged 15 to 24, surveyed in 21 countries around the world, said this: they often feel depressed or they have little interest in doing things. Now, up until recently, social and emotional learning wasn't taken into account as much as it really should be. But the pandemic and its impact on the mental health of young people has started to shed light on this very important topic. And recently, for the first time, the OECD surveyed social and emotional skills and the way that they actually affect students' performances. The findings clearly demonstrate the connection between academic development and social-emotional development. So, to flesh this out for us, let me now invite to the stage Mark Brackett, who will also enlighten us about the power of emotions. Mark.
Hello, everybody. I guess my job is to ask you how you're feeling. Yes? Stavros is saying yes. So, welcome to this afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be here. And I'm going to ask us all to just take a moment to get settled in our seats. Maybe take a nice long inhale and a nice long exhale. So when I ask you the question, how are you feeling? It may be deceptively simple. Think about that for a minute. How are you feeling right now? What are the words that you would use to describe your 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or 5 feelings? And one of the things I want to share with you today is a tool that we developed to help us teach emotions, and it's called a mood meter. So as you can see on the x-axis, it says the word pleasantness. So all of you woke up this morning and you knew you were coming to a conference called WISE, Unmuting a Generation. How did that make you feel? Are you saying to yourself, this is going to be the worst conference of my life? Or are you saying, oh my goodness, an opportunity to learn from many people for 2 full days? Where is your brain right now? Do you want to approach? Do you want to avoid? Do you feel safe and comfortable, or do you feel like you need to run away? On the y-axis, it says the word energy. All of us have energy right now. Some of you look like you don't have very much energy. Others of you are like, I can take over the world. So what's your energy like right now? Do you feel depleted of your resources, or do you feel energized? Let me cross those 2 axes to create a tool that we call the mood meter. So I'm going to ask you right now, what color are you in today? Are you in the yellow, high energy and pleasant? Raise your hand if you're in the yellow. Green, you're pleasant, but your energy is kind of low. Yeah. Anybody in the blue or red? Notice no one said they're in the blue and the red. We're living through a pandemic, and no one is feeling a little anxious or worried or a little sad or disappointed. No? I'm definitely moving to Qatar. So, yay. Let me ask you to take a moment now and really get that word. What is that precise feeling word? Give me an honest raise of hands in the room. How many of you had some trouble finding the word? Anyone willing to agree to that? Hands up high. Okay. So the question is, why do we have difficulty describing our feelings? Well, a couple of things. One, if I ask you, how are you feeling? Well, ask me how I'm feeling. Everyone, 3, 2, 1. Fine. Isn't that what we mostly say? We just say fine, good, okay, busy, stressed. We don't get granular. We don't get specific. I'm feeling this odd mixture of anxiety, hopelessness, frustration, and optimism. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, ooh, I'm going to stay away from Mark today. So when we ask people how they're feeling, a few things we have to think about. One, do you feel safe and comfortable telling me how you really feel? Think about that for a minute. Do you actually feel safe and comfortable being your true, full feeling self? The second, if it's not happy, what might that person do with our feelings? Are they going to be supportive? Or are they going to say things like, good luck? I don't know about you. I grew up with two parents who loved me dearly. But they didn't really know a lot about emotions. So my mother had tremendous anxiety, and she would say things, don't tell me what's happening. I can't handle it. And I'd be like, wait a minute. I'm the one who can't handle it. And my father was an amazing man as well, but he would say, son, you gotta toughen up. You gotta toughen up, son. Now, look at me. Do I look like a tough guy? I mean, the question is, what is a tough guy anyway, right? We call that toxic masculinity nowadays. So the question that I've been thinking about over the course of my career is, how do we teach people these skills of emotional intelligence? And I think the first step is something that I call permission to feel. Like, do you believe that you and you and you have the permission to be your true, full feeling self? When someone asks you how you're feeling, can you be open and honest and authentic at home, at school, at work? What are the barriers to permission to feel? There are many. So I've been thinking a lot about this in my career, and I've come up with this term that we all need to strive to be emotion scientists as opposed to emotion judges. Let's think about that for a minute. The emotion scientist is open and curious about feelings. The emotion judge is critical and closed about feelings. The emotion scientists, when they fail at dealing with their emotions, let me get an honest answer from all of you. How many of you during the last 2 years of this crazy pandemic have just had a day where you're like, I can't take it anymore? Anyone? You're just like, I'm done. Can't do it. And so when you have that moment, what's your self-talk like? Is it, I'm a loser, I'm never going to get through this, I can't handle anymore, life is just awful? Or do you take a deep breath and you say to yourself, you know something? Today was one of those days. Wasn't one of my best days, but I'm going to go to sleep tonight. I'm going to think about what made me so activated today, and I'm going to try to learn some strategies to help me manage my emotions more effectively moving forward. So question for you, how many of you believe that your education provided you with the tools and the skills to be an emotion scientist? We have 2 people who raised their hand in the room. So the question is, all right, well, we all want to be emotion scientists. What are the underlying skills? And I spent a good part of the last 25 years trying to unpack those skills. We call them the skills of emotional intelligence. So what is the first skill? It's recognizing emotions. Mask wearing makes it a little harder, doesn't it? Like, how are you really feeling behind the mask? I mean, many of us have masks without masks. But putting that aside for a minute, recognizing emotions. How am I feeling? using a tool like the mood meter. So you can see here, maybe, there are lots of words that we can use to describe our feelings. We can get granular. I'm proud to say that my book, Permission to Feel, has been translated into 23 languages now. So we have these mood meters in many, many languages. But the first step is recognizing those feelings. What's going on for me? What's my pleasantness? What's my energy like? The second is understanding emotions. If I were to ask you right now, what's the psychological difference between anger and disappointment, between stress and anxiety? Do you know that in my research with hundreds of thousands of people, people cannot tell me the difference? They don't really know the psychological difference, that disappointment is about unmet expectations and anger is about injustice, that stress is about having too many demands and not enough resources, and anxiety is about feelings of uncertainty. And the question is, why does that matter? Why do we want to get to that labeling of emotions, to be precise? It's because we have a saying that when you can name it, you can tame it. When you can label it, you're more likely to regulate it. And why is that the case? Well, think about it. If you're a parent or a teacher working with a child, I hate school. How are they feeling? I hate school. What do you think? It looks like anger, but how do you know? You don't really know because behavior has no correlation with emotion. I may have learned in my neighborhood through my father that I have to display emotions that way to get attention, but it may have no bearing on what I'm actually experiencing on the inside. I was one of those kids. I had to be the tough guy. I hate school. I was really feeling fear and shame, but no one asked me the question, how are you feeling? So that labeling piece is critical. Then we have the E and the R, expressing emotions and regulating emotions. The knowing how and when to express our emotions with different people across different contexts. Discerning those feeling states. Is it safe for me to tell you how I'm feeling? Will you listen? Will you support me? And then finally, the largest skill of all, the one that most people ask us for training on, is emotion regulation. What are the underlying skills that we use to regulate the full range of emotions that we experience each day? So I'm going to ask us all to get good posture in our seats again. Take a nice long inhale and a nice long exhale. And as I wrap up my time with you this afternoon, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Do you have permission to feel? Was there someone in your development that gave you the permission to be your true, full, feeling selves? When I ask that question to tens of thousands of people a year, only about half of the people I speak to say they had what I call an Uncle Marvin. That person who was that compassionate emotion scientist who asked them that question, how are you feeling? And really listened and didn't judge. So if I can ask you to leave here today with one thing, it's first, please give yourself and everyone you love, and even the people you don't love that much, the permission to be their true, fulfilling selves. 2, strive to be an emotion scientist, not an emotion judge. 3, consider developing these skills of emotional intelligence, recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotions. And recognize one important thing about those skills: it's life's work. It's not something you learn at a workshop. It's something that you have to practice your entire life. I'm 52 years old. I thought the pandemic is here. I've got 25 years as an emotion scientist. No problem. And then I worked from home for 6 months with my family. And I was like, I need some strategies. This is hard work. We can never, ever predict how we're going to feel. We can't predict whether or not we're going to do so well in those different circumstances. So it's an everyday life's practice. So I'm going to wrap up by saying just one last thing. I've done a lot of research in my career, published 150 scholarly papers on the role of emotions and emotional intelligence. Got to travel around the world and I'm honored to be here today to talk about this work. And people often come up to me and say, you know, Mark, if you know about my life, I had a traumatic childhood. I had abuse and bullying in my childhood. But look, you made it. I say, what does that even mean, that you made it? Really, what does that mean, that you made it? So I'm going to ask you in my final few seconds to reflect on the children that you know in your lives. Do you believe they have their true ability to be their full feeling selves? And lastly, what I want to say is that what I've learned, at least, running around the world, is that at this point in time, our Surgeon General has said just today, we have a mental health crisis for our children. So in many ways, it is our moral obligation to ensure that every child gets the emotion education that they deserve. And what that really means is that it is our moral obligation as the adults who are raising and teaching kids to be the best possible role models for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Mark Brackett was the author of Permission to Feel, as you've been hearing, and Mark has certainly given us a lot to think about and ponder on, I think. For now, we'll bring in our next guest, who is Jo Ijun, who will join us remotely from Hong Kong. There she is. Jo Ijun is a journalist and a documentary producer. She's also an acute observer, just like Mark in a sense, of the rapid changes that our societies face, and more specifically, the Chinese society. Jo Ijun, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today from Hong Kong.
Hi, darling. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.
Alaikum assalam.
Happy to be here.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So, Jo Ijun, you've studied education systems and you've looked at them right around the world. We'll talk about that in a moment, and I'd also like you to talk about some of the changes that you've seen when it comes to emotional intelligence, just like Mark was telling us a moment ago. But first, let's focus on China, because here are the facts. So in the latest PISA ranking that took place in 2018, and that's the Program for International Student Assessment, by the way, China scored #1 in all 3 subjects, and these subjects were reading, math, and science, out of 77 international systems, which is quite impressive, a lot of people would say. Now, at the same time, however, the Chinese students' satisfaction with life in and out of school was among the lowest. How do we explain this? Could you explain to the audience the significance of this and the scope of the recent reforms that have been introduced by Chinese authorities that you've seen?
Yes, just because what you have told us, this great pressure on students. Now a major change is happening in China on the education system. It should be described as an earthquake effect. It may not directly relate to the pandemic. However, the COVID crisis has speed up the arrival of it. Since last July, the central government has announced a series of reforms targeting profitable after-school tutoring. All kinds of training that related to school subjects are banned. We are talking about a $70 billion industry. So overnight, people lost their jobs, stocks tumbled. The media has reported that the reforms are a part of a campaign to ease the burden and the pressure on Chinese students inside and outside school. So why Chinese families spend so much on after-school training? The reason may be China's one-size-fits-all university entrance exam, Gaokao. If the children do poorly on one test, they will have to go to a worse school, which in the long run could hurt their chance to get a decent job and financially support themselves as adults. In order to get a better score in the test, most of our children had to spend very long hours on homework besides after-school training. The media suggests that the drive behind this significant reform is that the government has realized rote learning won't produce innovative talents for the future. And the reality has already given the warming signal. A great number of university graduates in China cannot find a job match their professions. A declining birth rate is also concerned. Right. The current cost to raise and educate a child in China is just too high due to the competition. This reform came as a surprise to many. Some people just welcome and agree that our kids are too tired, and others are quite confused. Now, how can they win in the competition? To ease all the worries, the government also promised significant improvements on the vocational system so that in the future, the parents won't see vocational schools as a worst choice if their kids cannot make it to the universities. So like always, all these big reforms happen quickly, yet the outcome will take time to see. This time in China, the authority is quite determined to shift the education system from the capacity to quality.
Okay, so what about outside of China? Because you put together a documentary called Childhood, elsewhere, and the COVID-19 pandemic struck shortly after the release of that documentary. And based on what you've seen in different education systems around the world, talk to us about the reforms that you consider the most innovative or perhaps the most effective.
I found that positive reforms share one goal. It is not only about sharing the knowledge, it's about raising better human beings. In the UK, this is called whole person education. In China's comprehensive reform plan, the well-rounded development of an individual is mentioned. In Finland, positive pedagogy is becoming popular. Along with the traditional school subjects, positive pedagogy is an evaluation system emphasizing on character strengths, including teamwork, compassion, sense of humor, and love, which one of the teachers pointed out to me as the most important of all. All these are not skills for exams, but skills for life. What makes reforms more effective, in my view, is to learn from the others' experiences. I've met some principals and teachers from like remote areas in China. They've been quite lucky to get financial support from private funds to travel to schools in foreign countries. The trips opened their eyes and minds, and the fresh ideas they brought back combined with local circumstances made a lot of impact. Here, I have to point out that educators in many countries, they have very little opportunities to learn from global experiences. That's why a conference like this one and what can be done beyond this is quite important.
You know, Joey June, one of my panelists yesterday was talking about how difficult it is sometimes to enact reforms in long-standing cultures. So let me ask you this. How do you think we can actually bring effective education reform to society in the face of these long-standing cultures that exist, while at the same time honoring and preserving them? Is it difficult?
Indeed, it's a very big question. It might be similar to people in the Middle East. Chinese are particularly proud of our long-standing culture and the traditions. How to blend those traditions and the culture into the modern education, it's really big. I think, first of all, we should understand what is the essence of them. Here, I like to give one example. So Elon Musk, so you may have heard, the founder of Tesla, created a school for his children and their peers. In that school, students are asked not to write, but to type since day one. This is a revolutionary idea, but unthinkable for Chinese parents, because we think our written language is not only a tool for communication, but it bears emotion and culture, culture identity. So that's why many Chinese students still spend long practicing calligraphy. Unless we understand why we want to keep the tradition and which part to be kept, we will have less struggle how to introduce them to the next generations.
Okay.
And another,
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're just running out of time. And since you mentioned parents, let me ask you this, because you are a parent, of course, and based on your own research, your experience as a parent, what should we value in education to build a better future? We have about 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, two things I hope my children will learn for the future. And number one is to have a screen of hobby, to be passionate for something one can do offline. Because I believe the future of science and technology developments will bring greater convenience, but not may not bring more freedom to our souls. So offline hobby may provide a piece of heaven at any time. Number two is just being a journalist. I think how to, like navigate news is quite important. I hope they will know how to make their own pictures out of many sources. Fact check should be studied as a must-have skill.
Thank you so much, Joey Jun. We appreciate your time. It was great to see you from Hong Kong. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So in the third part of our plenary for today, we'll discuss more in depth the opportunity that we have right now at hand and reforms that can strengthen our education systems as well as our societies. As we're saying, shocks can be powerful catalysts for innovation. The pandemic, you've been hearing, has been the biggest shock to our education in the last century, in fact. And in a sense, though, it has taught us many lessons. It's unveiled the limits of one-size-fits-all schooling, as we just heard from Hong Kong. Like it's pointed out as well, the necessity of involving and partnering with students and parents themselves. Many argue that the crisis we've experienced collectively has given us an opportunity to make a pivot that maybe we should have made a long time ago. So how do we redefine and how do we strengthen our education systems? That's the question that I'm going to put to my next panelists. Let's welcome on stage Siddharth Santosh, Dr. Monique Chisholm, and also Dr. David Senga. Welcome. Hi there. Monique in the middle, Siddharth, David Senga. Ooh, water. Welcome to you. Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. David Senga, you are the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education. You're also the Chief Innovation Officer for the Government of Sierra Leone. So let me ask you specifically, you've been on the front line, so to speak, during the pandemic when it came to ensuring the continuity of learning in Sierra Leone. Tell us about some of the reforms that you personally implemented.
Thank you very much for this. I mean, I think one of the things that we knew would happen when schools closed, and the data consequently has shown that across the world now, is a lot more girls will get pregnant. We knew that girls, when they drop out of school, it's much harder for them to re-enroll. And every day that a girl is limited, and the older they get, the more difficult it is. And for teenage girls, usually that leads into pregnancy. And we knew this from our experience during Ebola, right, that when we had about a 9-month school closure, upwards of 14,000 girls had gotten pregnant. And then they had been banned from going to school during that time. So one of the things that we did in anticipation was we went on a national engagement all across the country and on what we call the Zero School Girl Pregnancy Campaign, and engaged chiefs and leaders and communities and schools about not getting pregnant and about protecting the girls and having general conversations on sexual education. And then also then overturned the ban. The president and the government overturned the ban that had been in place from the previous government that limited visibly pregnant girls from going to school and taking examinations. So we removed that through what we call the radical inclusion policy that then looked beyond not just pregnant girls, but pregnant girls, parent learners, kids with disabilities, those from poor backgrounds and those from hard-to-reach areas.
So with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently, or what more needs to be done going forward?
I mean, I think there's elements around access to school and making sure that people are learning, access to education, access to learning. I do think something we ultimately did was we had what we call hybrid technology approaches, where we provided online learning, mobile-based learning, paper-based learning, radio, community radio. We could have rolled all of those out very early, and particularly with the paper-based solutions that we did much later on. With radical inclusion now, the idea really there is if you focus on the most vulnerable, if you focus on the most marginalized, the system you build is much more robust and is much more inclusive and is better for everybody else.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Monique Chisholm, you are the Undersecretary for Education at the Smithsonian Institution that's over in the United States. I wonder if you can talk to us about the role that museums and institutions play in education reforms, and did that strategy change or evolve in the past 2 years?
Thank you, and assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
So let me tell you just a little bit first about the Smithsonian. We are the world's largest museum education research complex. We have over 21 museums, 6 science centers, research centers, libraries, and a national zoo. And so as one of the world's largest complex centers, we're also funded by the federal government, but we have trust. So it's a quasi-government setup. So one of the opportunities that we took when the pandemic occurred is that we were getting a lot of inquiries from parents and also from teachers about how can we get access to your content because we can't actually be in the museums. So it actually accelerated us in a really significant way to start thinking about museums without walls. So we created a number of distance learning opportunities. We provided web-based coaching and training for teachers, professional development to help them with content. And we also set up some really strong inquiry practices around inquiry-based learning, problem solving, and questioning using objects. And so we, as an institution, totally pivoted to start thinking about how we could reach a broader base beyond Washington, D.C., across the nation, and even across the globe.
So are you saying that there is now an opportunity to incorporate more content from these institutions like the Smithsonian into actual curriculums, and what would that look like?
It would look fabulous. I think it would look wonderful. I used to work at the U.S. Department of Education, and one critique that I would offer is that I think that our curriculum has narrowed too significantly. With just a focus on reading and math, we have really lost what the essence of a well-rounded education means. So when you think about using museums and cultural institutions as a resource for content for the curriculum, you bring back in history, you bring back in social studies, you bring back in art and music and civics. All of the things that our previous speaker was just talking about that make that human connection, that help us understand ourselves better so that we can understand one another better.
Got it. Thank you so much. Siddharth Santosh, hello.
Hello, Darine. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well as well.
You're a research consultant at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi in India. You are also a wise young curator, so we're very glad to have you with us as well. You were on the ground, so to speak, I know, during the pandemic, and keeping an eye out on the role that the youth was playing when it comes to reforms in education. So how can the youth actually be catalysts for reform from what you've seen?
I mean, it sometimes feels like a no-brainer that the youth have not already been involved, in terms of making decisions. That's something that really changed during the pandemic. We saw that many systems, all the education systems that matter, that serve the students, are now looking back at the students and, like Professor Mark was saying earlier, asking them, how are you doing? Is this really what you want? Is this really how you want to study, right? And we feel like the years have opened up. So in a way to say that we have been unmuted in that sense, right?
How so? I wonder if you can just give us perhaps specific examples of what you've seen or what you've worked on yourself.
Absolutely. Something that I've seen happen a lot in India is that the youth in cities have been able to take tech platforms and absolutely turn it around, and not only use it to continue learning, so they've been able to create newer platforms in local languages, for that matter, and create learning content so that they can continue learning at home and so that their peers can continue learning. That's one. And the second is to ensure that COVID relief funds and COVID relief support for families and for people living in underserved communities reach them. So they've been very active with creating platforms, dashboards. We've got so many different examples from the country where they are now helping ensure that everybody is better off in the pandemic and no one's left behind.
Okay, well, speaking of no one being left behind, David Senga, Siddharth was just talking about kids in India and their access to tech platforms, but how do we ensure that underprivileged students, underprivileged kids, without access to that technology, are not left behind in this acceleration of distance learning and digital education that we've seen in the past 2 years, and that seemingly is going to continue according to what everyone is saying?
I mean, I think it's a valid point, and this is where all means all from the GEM report last year really comes in. But in addition, it is why we speak about hybrid technologies. Paper is technology. It's a very old form of technology, and it's still present. And it's that when we're building solutions, we have to think about those who are most excluded. We have to think about those who are ordinarily or typically not at the table, those who are not even in the room. And so for us in Sierra Leone, it is girls, it is kids who are from poor backgrounds, it is those who are in hard-to-reach areas, it's kids with seen and unseen disabilities. When we think about them and place them at the center of our solutions, we are bound to come up with hybrid solutions. And those solutions will work for everybody. That's one. And the second part is linked to the previous session, but it's about how you feel.
Yeah.
We just completed the early grade reading and early grade math assessments in Sierra Leone. We've not even published it yet. But
so are you giving us a scoop here?
Yes.
Okay.
80% of teachers feel that children should not be able to read fluently a short passage until grade 2 or grade 3. There's a section in there where we interview teachers. It's that the teachers themselves don't even have a good expectation of their children, of the students. So if you don't, and all of them, 100% of them do not believe that when you start in grade 1, you should understand basic emergent reading capabilities. And if the system does not believe that our children at age 6 should know how to read A, B, C, D, and count and do basic stuff, then that's where the problem starts. We have to think about how the system and our society in government, in schools, in communities, put the responsibility and engage with children, the learners themselves, engage with parents, and when they come to school, our expectation should not be that they should not know how to read or how to understand ABC or how to do basic emergent skills.
Yeah.
And finally, to the question that Mark had asked about permission to feel for kids. I don't think it's just for kids. As a minister, a staff of mine, because I got angry one day because somebody did not do something, and I expressed my anger, and my staff came back to me, an older staff. You know, Minister, I think you're really passionate, but I don't think you should let people know your emotion like this. And I get a lot of my colleagues who come, you're too emotional. I think you should. And so it's not just kids, it's us as leaders. We're not expected to feel frustrated and to feel angry and express that it is unacceptable that did not get done. Or I'm frustrated that you've not met the deadline. Or I'm mad at all of us for not making sure that the children have their books on time.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure Mark will have a lot to say about this. We'll ask him a little later on.
Engage him.
Monique, I know that you, in fact, have a lot to say about what David was saying a moment ago about the teachers and their expectations. So how can we actually reinvent relationships between students, teachers, and parents for better learning outcomes?
Yeah, I know a number of the sessions here are focused on personalized learning, but I'm going to jump on that bus. And so I think that what the pandemic taught us is that we have the opportunity to create learning environments in multiple places. You can now do synchronous, asynchronous, you can learn at home, you can learn in school buildings, you can learn in your community. And so I think that we have to think about schools without walls. And part of that means not putting all of the responsibility on the teacher. So right now, our teachers are expected to be everything to students. The academic, the social emotional, the counselor, the health nurse sometimes, the parent, the second parent. And so I've been thinking about a model. I'm probably not the first person to think about this, but a model similar to patient care. So when a patient has a problem or a challenge, you have a team that comes together to support your recovery. And so let's think about surrounding students with teams that support their learning. So obviously that includes the parents, but then thinking of the teacher more as a facilitator of learning, a coach of learning, and a networker who then extends the opportunities for the student to learn and grow from other people in the community, across the nation through video conferencing or teleconferencing, but really to think of the teacher as start to think in a more of a facilitator or a coaching
And is
manner.
then that the way that educators, as you've said, I'm quoting you here, educators help students become the best versions of themselves so our nation can become the best version of itself? Is that how you see the role of teachers evolving?
Yeah, I'm a passionate educator. So when ministers said that there's some teachers who have low expectations for students, I guess the first thing that I would do as a leader is ask them to leave. Because there's no space for any educator who does not believe the full potential of every single student. And so yes, as an educator, you have the responsibility to help students to become the best versions of themselves, because that's going to be our future. It's a shared future that we have together, and if we're not cultivating that future, then we're in trouble.
Siddharth, what's your take on all of this? How do you see the role, the evolving relationships between students, teachers, and parents taking place in order to guarantee better learning outcomes for students?
I mean, traditionally, we are looking at schools as spaces where students come, they learn, and they leave. But I think it's time that we look at, we reimagine schools as social spaces that work at multiple different levels, right? So, the minister was mentioning about girl children getting pregnant. In India, we have this massive central scheme that's called the midday meal. And students are served a meal at the school. And now during the lockdown, we saw that students couldn't access that meal. And that was the main reason many students were even coming to school, right? Many public schools, all public schools actually had to serve this meal. And the system had to change during the pandemic. So now instead of, the school became a space where parents could come and collect the rice that they were getting earlier in the school. So that's one example where it's beyond just learning, it's this. And then parents now had to come to school to collect the worksheets that the teachers had spent so many hours making so that the students can continue learning at home. Mm-hmm. That's another level of learning. And then students also wanted to come back to school. I mean, it's a space where we want to be. And then, really rethinking what works. When we're going to come back, what's going to still work? What's going to be possible? Schools opened again in India. They're again closing down because of the new variant that's going around. Yeah. So it's a complex, it works at many different levels. And I think it's time we reimagine schools as social spaces rather than just a place with two stakeholders. I think that puts so much pressure on teachers and so much pressure on the government and middle-tier administration.
Well, from what you're saying, it was recognized for a short time during the pandemic. From the sense that you're getting, is this something that's going to extend?
Absolutely. I think it was a long enough period for everybody to realize that this needs to stick.
So what are the opportunities then for civil society actors and other institutions? Mm-hmm. Monique comes from the Smithsonian Institution. Mm-hmm. What can they do, in your opinion, to contribute to education reform?
I mean, civil society organizations, again, are a super important stakeholder in the entire process, right? So many, what we've observed in India is that the government now says, okay, we understand that these are our skills, these are the things that we are good at, but there are also things that only civil society organizations can continue doing. Last mile access is a brilliant example of that. There are so many civil society organizations. I think we've got them attending the panel today, the conference. We've got Dream a Dream, we've got Pratham, who are working endlessly, using their networks, continuing to build and reach students in the last spaces. And I think going ahead, we need to keep them in the decision-making space. We need to ensure that they are active in the school spaces through committees. We have the school management committees in India, for example, where the parents, village administration, and even the teachers are involved in deciding how the school should continue functioning. I think civil society organizations should also continue being in this space more active.
Minister Singha, we were talking a moment ago about the tech acceleration, so to speak, and how that's impacted students. But how do you think it's impacted the role of teachers in Sierra Leone and elsewhere, if you are familiar with it, or you can give us the experience of Sierra Leone?
I mean, I think before I get to that, what I'm getting from the two panelists here is the difference between schooling and learning. I think the one thing the world has understood, or where I think it's coming clearly here, is that learning can take place at school. Right. But school is not the only place that learning takes place. And what we want for our children is learning, is education. And the school is just a framework. And when that happens, then we need to think about teachers and teaching beyond not just those who have certificates. In Sierra Leone, about 40% of my teachers have teaching certificates, basic minimum certificate. So the certificate does not make the teacher. So a teacher, the person who's responsible for learning, and like Monique's framework, the equivalence of care providers, and I don't know what you call them, learning providers or something, come up with a name, then we'll all use it, has to include teachers, parents, community providers. And if we think about that, then to your question around technology, how does technology play in? How do we accelerate making sure that children and learners have access to the right set of information? And even if we're talking about teaching at the right level, customized learning, taking the child to reach his or her fullest potential, then it becomes a framework that has to be customized to that learner, to that community, and to that society. And in Sierra Leone, one of the things that we have done is focus on data and evidence, and technology we're using mostly to inform data and evidence at school level. And so our annual school census that we get, which informs policy. More recently, we're now rolling out tablets at the school administrators level. So every school will have a tablet, and we'll use this to engage and understand how they are managing resources. And then you go beyond that, and we build these mobile-based solutions. A dictionary, I grew up reading a dictionary. Dictionary is important for learning, and we take it for granted. But most people don't have access to a dictionary. So we build these mobile-based solutions of SMS and USSD, where anybody, anywhere you are, 84% of the people have access to mobile connectivity, but only 20% have access to internet. But then, so you build a system where you can probe with your 1G, 2G, and you can ask for the meaning of a word, and it sends you an SMS for free. And we have to build systems that allow parents to engage. Exams, it used to take 6-10 weeks for people to know the results, particularly in rural areas. And you had to pay money up to $10. Most people didn't have that. So we build mobile-based systems where anybody, anywhere across the country now, as long as you know your child's unique ID, can probe the system and know your results in an instance, so you don't have to wait for 10 weeks because you're poor and living in an urban area.
Yeah.
You and the person in Freetown can access your results at the same time. So technology has the potential to equalize access to solutions, quality learning solutions, and we have to think about hybrid systems that allow for it to work for everybody.
Okay, yeah. Siddharth, I know you want to say something. Go ahead.
I can just add that
Yeah.
it's very important to have monitoring and evaluation systems. I completely agree, and that collecting this information is very critical. But what we have seen, I think there's a lot of evidence pointing that this information remains very inaccessible to parents. So even if it is being collected and it is being stored in a manner which the district administrators are trained to understand and trained to use, it still remains largely inaccessible for parents. So different initiatives like school report cards, or even just explaining what this data means, right? Like to say that numbers are there, but this is what it implies. We've got this much percentage of students attending the class. This is what it means. These are the reasons as to why they've not been attending class. So to try to go beyond just collecting data and to ensure that it's accessible for everybody, for every other stakeholder possible.
That is the challenge, though.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but there are solutions. There are solutions. For example, we have the ASER report, the ASER report that comes out in India and it's conducted by the Pratham Foundation. It's amazing that the way they've managed to collect data on what's happening at schools, what's really happening, who's learning, who's coming in to teach, what's the quality of that really looking like, and to then ensure that it's shared in a manner that's easy to understand through different events, through different, the different ways you can put out that content there. But it's a challenge that does have solutions.
Yeah.
It can be met, yeah.
Monique, you want to add on to anything?
Yeah, I'm thinking more about the assessment question. And for me, assessments have played a kind of a necessary evil, I think, in our...
How so?
Well, in many ways, the assessment is a way to help to address equity. Because when you have a set of standards and you're measuring against those standards, you can then look at data disaggregated by student group and understand how close or far away students are from proficiency. But the challenge with that is that they're used as gatekeepers for access. In many different ways, our testing systems are used as gatekeepers for access. And I think that we would be better served as a nation if we shifted towards competency-based understanding and learning and assessments. However, we would then have no way to sort people into who's doing better or worse. And so I think that it goes back to this question between schooling and learning. What is the purpose of education? And what do we really want in terms of access for all students? What does that mean? Because then I think the assessments start to play a different role. If you ask those questions authentically and you're thinking about it from a humanity perspective, I think the role of assessment starts to play a different role.
So, Monique, is it a matter of redefining our education systems or strengthening our education systems?
Well, I think that we've been at this for a little while, for hundreds of years, and trying to get this education and formal education and schooling right. And we know from the PISA, and also we know from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that achievement has pretty much flatlined. About 30% of our students are demonstrating proficiency on these tests. So I think it's time to rethink the whole thing. It's not producing the outcomes that, or perhaps it is producing the outcomes that are intended. But if we're going to get better as a nation, we will have to start focusing on competencies like empathy, problem solving, understanding, really thinking about sustainability and how we as a nation support thinking about our common good. So I think it's time to rethink this whole thing.
Okay, rethink is the word you're using. David Senga, is it about rethinking? Is it redefining or strengthening?
I think the SDG 4 is quite clear. If you look at SDG 4, the key words in there, equitable, quality, lifelong learning, I think we need to go back and look. There's the goal that we set for ourselves, 2030, and I think we were here. The pandemic shook us, and we realized, this is where we're supposed to go. But we're not going there. Now is the point for us, rethink, reimagine. Our objective is here. 2030 is not far away. We need to meet the SDG 4 priorities. They speak about equitable, they speak about quality, they speak about lifelong learning, and there are elements within that. And actually in Sierra Leone, at the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, we adapted the ASA test. We looked at all the different tests. We took the ASA, we adapted it, and we ran what we call an Education Innovation Challenge across all, I think, 340 schools, and did those tests, and now we're 2 periods in. And this is one of those instances where we are learning from other countries as well. But we have to go back to SDG 4. Mm-hmm. The people who defined it were right. It was a consortium of everybody around the world. It's clear. Let's make sure we achieve those things by 2030.
But also, David Senga, our societies these days, a lot of people would say, are so fractured and they're so fragmented and there are a lot of issues going on. So do you think that reforms in education can actually lead to less division, more understanding, more compassion, and more unified societies ultimately?
Education is our only hope for the world. It is not negotiable. We cannot have a sustainable world. We cannot talk about climate change. We cannot talk about world peace. We cannot talk about sustainable energy. We cannot talk about anything without equitable quality education for all. That's where everything starts.
Siddharth, yeah, I'll come to you in a moment, but Siddharth?
Yeah, just to kind of add on that, right? Just earlier today, we had a panel where we were discussing education for sustainable development, so ESD curriculums, and we had different youth panelists who work in different types of organizations, and we came across a similar question where we were like, is it time to reimagine the entire thing, or is it time to just strengthen what we're already existing? And all of us agreed that we should strengthen it. So I'm kind of surprised that the youth are actually saying here that, we have taken a long time to come to where we are, and it's taken a lot of effort to get to here, and we recognize the effort that the teachers are putting in, that everybody across different levels of the government, the civil society organizations are putting in. But we also want to ensure that, one, we are included in how we're thinking about how to go ahead. So whether it's co-creating the content that we're going to be learning, right, for one example of that. And then ensuring that every other stakeholder who's been traditionally ignored as well, civil society organizations, for example, rope them in a little more. And instead of it sounds like a very expensive thing to be doing if you want to reimagine the entire thing. If you want to redesign your entire system, I would really instead hope that we strengthen it based on where we are, and hope that we can hope that we can do this in a more inclusive manner going ahead.
So it's a school's responsibility then, Siddharth, from what you're saying, to empower students to take civic action.
Absolutely, but not only the schools.
Not only the schools, yeah.
Schools are one part
Yeah,
of this.
yeah.
Like Minister was saying, education and learning may not necessarily only be the school's role, right? There are parents who are the caregivers are very active with this. Peer learning is happening so much more going ahead. And yeah, there are other stakeholders too.
Okay, Monique?
I was just going to comment. I thought the question was so good about like reflecting on how divisive we are in many
Yeah.
aspects of the world right now. Actually, in the United States, there's legislation that's passing widely across many states. It's passed in 12 states already, and 13 are about to adopt policies that would prohibit the teaching of race or racism, gender or sexism in the classroom in a way that makes people feel uncomfortable. And so I agree with the minister that it's only through education that we are ever going to tackle these big challenges. But when we have policies in place that don't even let teachers teach the truth, then we have taken many, many, many steps backwards.
So what you're saying is, from what you've seen, at least in the US, the political will might be lacking?
I definitely. I always think it's a question of will.
Yeah.
So I believe that our teachers have the skill. I believe our leaders mostly have the skill. And I always think it's a question of will.
So what would you like to see going forward?
So going forward, I mean, I think that what we really need to focus on is helping to have these conversations. And so recognizing that our history, it is mired in many different challenges, and that it's not about, in my mind, it's not about blame, it's not about guilt, but it is about understanding so that we can make sure that these things don't happen in the future. So I'd like to help equip teachers to feel prepared to have conversations about discrimination, sexism, racism in the classroom, so to help prepare us for a better future. We have to understand our history in order to understand where we're going together.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. We have 30 seconds or so.
I
Last
think
word.
I slightly disagree with it. The systems have not been working for everyone. We have to accept that the solutions that we had were not working for everyone, and people were getting left behind. So we're not breaking down the whole system, but we have to reimagine the solutions, because if we keep doing what we've been doing, many more will be left behind. And this is why it's important that we have political will, and we should include the non-state actors, the role of civil society, the role of NGOs, the role of you and me. And I think public education is our hope for the future.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for this panel. Very interesting discussion. We appreciate your time. Thank you. Thank you. Just this way. So thank you so much. That was the last panel for right now, and thank you for your attention and your participation in this session. We will see you back here, just a reminder, at 3:45 p.m. for the WISE Awards celebration and also the plenary session. The WISE Awards is going to recognize the 6 most innovative educational projects from around the world, so you won't want to miss it. And you'll actually meet with the inspiring winners, you'll be able to see them, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from Tanmay Bakshi. He's a young, brilliant artificial intelligence expert. He'll speak to us about the potential of AI to revolutionize learning. And right after, experts will explore 2 fundamental pillars to recover from the learning crisis: innovation as well as financing. In the meantime, just a reminder that I encourage you to take part in the rest of the program, whether you're online or right here in Doha. Don't miss the opportunity to ask anything to Mark Brackett, who you heard just a short while ago, and also to the famous football player and future doctor Nadia Nadim, who's also here at WISE, in the experiential rooms on the 2nd floor. And as well, all masterclasses and workshops happen on the 2nd floor too. You can visit the Mejlis and the Spotlight discussion area. Get insights from our partners, Leone Fund, Qatar Foundation, International, and Teach for All. They'll all be holding virtual sessions. So there you go. There's a lot that you can do. And you can keep up with all of this on the app website, of course, so don't forget to check it out. And thank you so much. The session, I'm being told, just a correction, is at 3:30 this afternoon and not 3:45, so we apologize for that. I'll leave you for now, but we will see you later on. Thank you so much.